Hello, and welcome to Crusading History, discussing the latest research into the Crusades, Crusading, and the Crusading. The Crusading period saw an outpouring of literature in a variety of languages, much of which is relevant for our understanding of the events. One such body of work is Arabic language al-Quds literature, which has been almost wholly ignored in research into the area. But what was al-Quds literature? Who wrote it? And how does it impact our understanding of the events? With me to discuss al-Quds literature from the Crusading period and the Mamlūk period is Dr Fadi Ragheb, a historian of the Central Islamic lands in the period of the Crusades, who has recently completed a PhD thesis on al-Quds literature at the University of Toronto. So Fadi, thank you very much for joining us here today to talk about your thesis. So to begin with, could you explain what Faḍāʻil literature is?
Sure. The Faḍāʻil literature basically translates to the religious merits or the religious praises. And the Faḍāʻil literature, more generally speaking, is actually quite a large corpus in medieval Islamic writings. The Faḍāʻil literature deals with different topics in which you have writings that extol, for example, the sanctity and the status of certain figures in the faith, or certain regions, or certain rituals. So, for example, you have Faḍāʻil al-Quran, which speaks about the religious merits of the Quran. You have Faḍāʻil al-Salah, the religious merits of prayer. You have Faḍāʻil al-Hajj, obviously, and you have a subset of the genre that is called Faḍāʻil al-Buldan. Faḍāʻil al-Buldan meaning here the religious praises of regions and countries. And within the Faḍāʻil al-Buldan, you have traditions that are written and circulated regarding certain regions. You have the Faḍāʻil of Mecca, Faḍāʻil of Medina, and you have, of course, the Faḍāʻil of al-Quds, Faḍāʻil al-Quds, the Faḍāʻil of Jerusalem. Now, the Faḍāʻil literature, although it's a genre that came to evolve during the medieval period, technically speaking, it's made out of individual traditions from Quranic verses, Quranic tafsir, the exegesis, hadith reports, sayings of the Prophet, and sayings and reports from the companions of the Prophet and the first generation of Muslims, at-Tabi'un. So you have basically those traditions that address the sanctity of or the piousness of a figure or a ritual or a region or a country. You also have, in terms of Faḍāʻil al-Buldan specifically, you have historical reports on the history of the conquest of that region during the early Islamic conquests, the Islamic history of that region or that country during a certain significant period or episode in its history. So if we look at the Faḍāʻil of Quds, for example, you have historical reports on the early Islamic conquest of the city under the second rightly guided Caliph, Umar ibn Khattab, and the fascinating narrative we have of Umar entering the city and visiting the Temple Mount and cleaning the Sakhra, the holy rock. But you also have the historical reports on the building of the Dome of the Rock included within the Faḍāʻil al-Quds literature, which was built by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik. So we have all those reports that survey the history of that significant episode in the history of the city. So in a nutshell, the Faḍāʻil genre is a genre about praising the sanctity and the piousness and the unique status of a pious figure or a region or a ritual. And within that subset, you have Faḍāʻil al-Buldan, which is the Faḍāʻil of the countries and regions. And Faḍāʻil al-Quds is quite a major subset of that genre because we have, as we speak along this interview, we have a lot of Faḍāʻil al-Quds books that were written on Jerusalem during the medieval period.
Okay, thank you. So if we move on to these Faḍāʻil texts that talk about Jerusalem, when did Muslim writers begin composing Faḍāʻil for Jerusalem specifically? And how did that body of writing evolve over time?
Sure. First of all, we have to distinguish between a Faḍāʻil tradition, the origination of a Faḍāʻil tradition on Jerusalem, and the Fadā'i'l al-Quds books themselves.
Mm.
So when we look at the singular or individual Fadā'i'l traditions on the sanctity of Jerusalem, for example, you have the Quranic verse, chapter 17, verse 1, about commemorating the Prophet's night journey to Jerusalem, al-Isra, or we have that famous hadith from the Prophet on you shall set to pilgrimage only to three places, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. Those individual traditions within the Fadā'i'l al-Quds corpus arose and circulated during the first century Hijri, or around the mid-7th century AD Common Era. So those individual traditions have been circulating for the first century of Islam, and they circulated with more proliferation during the Umayyad period, towards the end of the 7th century AD and the beginning of the 8th century AD. Now, we can see that the circulation of those traditions not only sanctified the city, but it also, during the Umayyad period, had its own political and theological purposes, because the Umayyads wanted to make Jerusalem as a spiritual center to their new empire based in Damascus. Now, that's for the individual traditions themselves. In terms of the actual books that collected and wrote down those individual traditions, we find that the earliest book on Fadā'i'l al-Quds emerged in the middle of the 3rd Hijri century, or the middle of the 9th century AD. It's the book by al-Ramli that is basically titled Fadā'i'l al-Quds. So the first actual book that collects all those traditions and writes them down emerged in the mid-9th century. And then a couple of centuries later, during the Middle Abbasid and Fatimid period, we have what we say a certain boom or a spike in Fadā'i'l al-Quds books writing that are written during the medieval period. And that is during the 11th century. We have around 4 books, and 2 of them are extant and are actually quite important because they serve as authoritative sources for later Fadā'i'l al-Quds texts that were written during the Crusading period and during the Mamlūk period. Those 2 works are by al-Wasiti, which is called Fadā'i'l al-Bayt al-Muqaddas. Al-Bayt al-Muqaddas or Bayt al-Maqdis or al-Quds is the Arabic or Islamic names for Jerusalem. And the other one is by Ibn al-Murajja al-Maqdisi, which is called Fadā'i'l al-Quds wa Sham, the praises of Jerusalem and Ash-Sham, Greater Syria. So we have those 2 books that emerged in the 11th century, and luckily for us historians, they are actually extant and they have been edited and published. So that takes us really to the pre-Crusades period. And in terms of the Crusades period, we begin to see certain changes to the Fadā'i'l al-Quds corpus. Now, when we look back at the pre-Crusade texts, we find that the authors are normally average scholars, and they are mostly Jerusalemite. They are from Jerusalem, and they're Shafi'i. Now, during the Crusading period, the purpose of the Fadā'i'l al-Quds changes. Before the onset of the Crusades, a part of the objective or purpose of writing those Fadā'i'l al-Quds books is to actually entice Muslims to come visit Jerusalem and do pilgrimage there. So we find in the 11th century text of Ibn al-Murajja, we find that there's actually a specific pilgrimage itinerary that directs the Muslim pilgrim to specific holy sites in the city, mainly on the Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, where it provides great detail of what a pilgrim should do. For example, where the pilgrim should enter the Dome of the Rock, how he or she should approach the holy rock there, etc., etc. Now, during the Crusading period, the Fadā'i'l al-Quds books took on a more of an ideological character to them in the counter-Crusade movement. So since the purpose of the works is to fundamentally extol Jerusalem, they were composed for the courts of Nur ad-Din Zengi, the Zengids, and the Ayyubids, with Salah ad-Din and the later Ayyubids, to basically not only encourage the masses and remind them of the sanctity of Jerusalem now that the holy city has been lost to the Franks after the First Crusade, but also to encourage those Muslim leaders to continue the jihad to recapture Jerusalem. Now, during the Crusading period, what is interesting is that you have eminent scholars such as Ibn Asakir, members of the Ibn Asakir families, writing Fadā'i'l al-Quds works. Those works were read in mosques. For example, before the Battle of Hittin, they were read to the soldiers, to the armies of Salah ad-Din before warring against the Franks and capturing Jerusalem in 1183. And in the later Ayyubid period, as you know, of course, and others probably know, Jerusalem experienced a very insecure situation where the later Ayyubids, the descendants of Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, basically bartered the fate of the city in terms of for forming alliances and survival mechanisms for themselves. So the famous episode is when Al-Kamil basically gave Jerusalem to Frederick II. We read that in Damascus, Ibn al-Jawzi was asked to compose and read Fadā'i'l al-Quds in the mosque there, in the great mosque of Damascus, to basically remind the Muslim populace about the loss of Jerusalem to Frederick II, but also within the civil war events of the Ayyubid households in Syria and Egypt. So that takes us to basically the Crusading period, where we see that the treatises are shorter and they're written by more eminent scholars, such as members of the Ibn Asakir family and Ibn al-Jawzi from Baghdad, who lived in Damascus. And then the Fadā'i'l al-Quds literature really takes a significant turn with the onset of the Mamlūk period. So we're talking here after 1250, in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. And during the Mamlūk period, we know that by 1291, the Franks were comprehensively defeated, and they left the Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean by 1291. So you have the Mamlūks there in complete control of Jerusalem and Palestine. And one major policy that the Mamlūk state and society wanted to do during the Mamlūk period was to re-Islamize Jerusalem after the loss of the Holy City to the Franks from 1099 to the 1180s, which is about 9 decades or so. And then the precarious position that Jerusalem experienced under the later Ayyubids. For example, the later Ayyubids, as you know, they destroyed the walls of Jerusalem. And the Mamluks saw that in order for them to re-enshrine and re-engender Jerusalem within the faith, they need to invest in the religious architecture, topography, and in the actual sacred character of the city once again. So here we see the building of tens of institutions that accommodated pilgrims. So we have the building and the founding of many madrasas, Dar al-Quran, Dar al-Hadith. We find a lot of places for Sufis to come and visit, such as Sufi khanqas, ribats, turbas, zawiyas. So the Mamluks really transformed Jerusalem once again into an Islamic city through its momentous Islamic architecture that is unparalleled in medieval Islamic history, except with the Umayyads and the building of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Jama al-Aqsa, the congregational mosque there. Now, with this new architectural religious projects and institutional foundations, we have the rise and the what I call the zenith of pilgrimage to Jerusalem during the late medieval period. You have many pilgrims coming in from the records of documents, the records of institutions built during the Mamluk period, and finally, from the record of the Fadā'i'l al-Quds corpus itself. We find that more than 30 Fadā'i'l al-Quds works have been composed during the Mamluk period. Not all of them survived, of course. I was able to locate 13 extant works, Fadā'i'l al-Quds works. Many of them were written by scholars of different backgrounds. So now we see scholars from the 4 Sunni madhabs, the 4 major Sunni madhabs, writing about the Fadā'i'l al-Quds. We see the authors emerging from Al-Maghrib and Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, and from Egypt, from Iraq, from as far east as Khawarizm and Bilad al-Hind, the Indian provinces. So those figures that authored the Fadā'i'l al-Quds, some of them actually did their pilgrimage to Jerusalem and wrote the Fadā'i'l al-Quds during their stay. In fact, one of the most famous Fadā'i'l al-Quds works from the Mamluk period, written by Shams al-Din al-Suyuti, not the famous Jalal al-Din Suyuti, another al-Suyuti. He wrote a work called Ithaf al-Akhissa bi Fadā'i'l al-Masjid al-Aqsa. He includes an autobiographical section of his life, including his travel and stay in Jerusalem and his pilgrimage here. So the Mamluk period, in terms of the institutional building, the religious foundations created, and the number of Fadā'i'l Quds written, with the different backgrounds of the authors, and many of them who visited the city, we see really an explosion of the movement of Islamic pilgrimage to the city, which is paralleled with the spike in production of Fadā'i'l Quds books during the Mamluk period.
So modern scholars began studying the Fadā'i'l literature about Jerusalem in the 17th century, though often for what we might term non-Islamic reasons. What were they actually looking for in these texts when they began studying them?
Sure. The early modern and modern scholarship on the Fadā'i'l Quds is quite fascinating in Western scholarship, because we see the beginning of the study of the Fadā'i'l Quds from the late 17th century. So really what began it all is two aspects. First is you have Edward Pocock, which is the first Laudian professor of Arabic. He visited Aleppo and he stayed there for a while. And when he left Aleppo, he brought with him hundreds of manuscripts, which forms the collection, the Pocock collection at the Bodleian Library. And one of those manuscripts was Mujir ad-Din's Faḍā'i'l work, the Faḍā'i'l and Chronicle work of Mujir ad-Din, al-Uns al-Jalil. So that manuscript was in the Bodleian Library, and it was accessed by one of the most important early modern scholars of Islam, Simon Oakley, who taught at Cambridge. So Simon Oakley wrote the most famous work during that period, The History of the Saracens. Its importance was because it is the first work in English that writes the history of early Islam based on the Arabic sources. And one of the sources he used was this manuscript that Pocock brought with him, which is Mujir ad-Din's al-Uns al-Jalil, بتاريخ القدس والخليل. So the Fadā'i'l Quds were first interested scholars in the West because they are about an important city, which is Jerusalem. So we can see it first as an aspect of comparative religion, about seeing what Muslims thought of Jerusalem and what Muslims thought of biblical traditions and biblical prophets and biblical figures that are associated with Jerusalem. The other impetus behind the Western interest and curiosity about the Fadā'i'l Quds is the availability of manuscripts within Western libraries. So we have, for example, the Mujir ad-Din's manuscript brought back by Pocock, but we also have other manuscripts from the Mamluk period we find cataloged in the Bibliothèque du Roi, which is today the Bibliothèque de Paris, the Paris library. And within the catalog there, we find there are essays written by French scholars describing those manuscripts and describing the different texts of Fadā'i'l Quds from the Mamluk period. I mean, they don't label it Mamluk period, but they're describing them from the late medieval period. So their availability in libraries basically gave impetus to scholars to write about them and to catalog them in their bibliographical works. So we see, for example, the French Orientalist D'Herbelot in his most famous work, the Encyclopédie Orientale. So in his Encyclopédie Orientale, under the entry Tarikh al-Quds, which is the history of Jerusalem, he lists all the Fadā'i'l Quds works as histories of Jerusalem. So that further added basically new studies on Jerusalem in the West, which led to the beginning of the critical editing and translation of Fadā'i'l Quds works in the 18th and 19th century. We see Antoine Galland, who's famously known for 1001 Arabian Nights. He translated the 1001 Arabian Nights. He actually translated parts of Fadā'i'l Quds works, and they were published posthumously after his death. And in the 19th century, we have this acceleration of translation of Fadā'i'l Quds works. Ithaf al-Akhissa by Shamsuddin al-Suyuti was translated completely in English by James Reynolds. in the first quarter of the 19th century. And even though the translation was not very accurate, but you can see why he is interested in this work, because his notes on the text are quite large and extensive, because he is dealing with comparative religion, comparing how the biblical tradition views figures versus how Muslims view the same figures within the Fadā'i'l al-Quds. So that takes us to the 19th century. And by the 20th century, but in the 19th century, we have this other movement in the West, which is this Victorian revivalism of interest in biblical archaeology. So we see extensive efforts by the British in Palestine in the 19th century for basically scanning the Holy Land for producing major geographies, major works of architecture and archaeology, such as the Survey of Western Palestine and the Palestine Exploration Fund and their publications. So those works also relied on the Fadā'i'l al-Quds to give them insight on the history of Islamic Jerusalem and the different Islamic holy sites in the city. So in their desire to basically look at biblical archaeology as true archaeology or a true record of the history of the city, authors in the 19th century, they relied on the Fadā'i'l al-Quds, and they incorporated their readings and what's written there in their catalogs, whether it's geography, architecture, topography of the holy city. So that is really what I've defined in my thesis as the proto-research period, the early research period done in the West on the Fadā'i'l al-Quds, which is quite rich and extensive, and something very surprising and unpredictable that I found during my research.
Okay, so then in the 20th century, if we move on to that, how did figures like Shivan and Grabar reshape the field of study of these texts? Did they help establish Faḍā'i'l literature as a more serious historical source?
Yes. So in the second half of the 20th century, what I refer to as the first period of critical scholarship and the second period of critical scholarship, we see scholars such as Goitein and Mir J. Kister, Israeli scholars, studying individual traditions of the Fadā'i'l al-Quds. Of course, here we're dealing with the importation of methodologies from biblical studies and Islamic studies, which are the tradition critical approach to those traditions in the Fadā'i'l al-Quds.
Sorry, could you for example, in his define that approach?
Sure. So there are different approaches within modern scholarship on how to study history. So the first approach is basically the traditional approach, which is Western scholars basically taking the Islamic chronicles at face value and basically saying that what the reports from the Islamic chronicles say actually happened. And then you have the critical comparative approach where, of course, you know that yourself, where you in order for you to delineate the history of an episode, you have to look at several different chronicles written hopefully from the same period the event happened, but if not later, but as long as you're comparing them to other works, and you extract the hard facts, quote unquote, of the events. Now, there was another methodological tradition that was pioneered by Ignaz Goldziher and other German scholars in the 19th and early 20th century, which is the tradition critical approach. The tradition critical approach is basically studies the veracity of a tradition, whether it's a hadith or a tafsir or an athar, a tradition from the early companions and early followers of Islam, based on the veracity of the actual tradition in terms of the isnad, the chain of transmission. So they study the chain of transmission that transmitted this report from the age of the Prophet to the first century to the second century, and what is the substance of that hadith. So based on the soundness of this chain of transmission, we can agree whether this tradition is sound or not, the substance of it. So the Israeli school of Goitein and Kister and Herbert Busi were really pioneers in studying the individual traditions within the Fadā'i'l al-Quds corpus. So the famous hadith on you shall not set out except the three mosques, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, was studied extensively in a famous article by Kister, where he studied the transmission chain and compared this tradition to other traditions to see the veracity of this enticement of pilgrimage or commandment of pilgrimage by Muhammad to Muslims. So the Israeli school began to study the traditions individually. Now, the turning point was when Ishaq Hassan, he did a excellent critical edition of the 11th century Fadā'i'l al-Quds work by al-Wasiti. So there was one manuscript of al-Wasiti in Al-Jazzar Library in Akka, in Acre. And this manuscript ended up being in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And Kister, who was the supervisor of Hassan, he gave him a copy of that manuscript and Hassan did his MA dissertation by doing a critical edition on this Fadā'i'l al-Quds work. Now, this became a groundbreaking moment. Why? Because it made the work available to scholars of Islamic Jerusalem and historians. Sivan, for example, he published an article based on this work that surveys the early history of the Fadā'i'l al-Quds up to the pre-Crusading period. So he describes the Fadā'i'l al-Quds of al-Wasiti and the Fadā'i'l al-Quds of al-Musharraf ibn al-Murajjah. And he wrote an excellent article after that, a couple of articles where he surveys the history of the Fadā'i'l al-Quds during the Crusading period, all the way to the Mamlūk period. So Sivan's his impact on the field is that he was the first to provide a historical survey of the production and the use and the meaning of the Fadā'i'l al-Quds during the Crusading period. So here the field gathered steam and momentum because now you're applying rigorous methodology from Islamic studies and Islamic history onto the field. However, it did not come without its opposition. Oleg Grabar, for example, he opposed the veracity of the Fadā'i'l al-Quds, and he says that the architectural descriptions and the topographical descriptions we find in the Fadā'i'l al-Quds are inaccurate and confusing. And he came out and he even said that those works are not even pilgrimage works. Of course, now we know, after the work of Amikam Elad, which I will describe now, and based on my dissertation where I showed that Al-Nabulsi and others used the Fadā'i'l al-Quds as pilgrimage guides. And they corroborated what they saw in the Fadā'i'l al-Quds with what they wrote about and what they saw in firsthand during their pilgrimage to the city. So Grabar showed some skepticism, and I wrote about that in detail in my dissertation, regarding the use of the Fadā'i'l al-Quds for an architectural historian or even a historian generally of Islam and Islamic Jerusalem. Another turning point happened in what I call the second period of critical scholarship, which is the last quarter of the 20th century. It is the work of Amikam Elad at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So Amikam Elad, what he did is that he applied the tradition critical approach to the Fadā'i'l al-Quds hadith, and he found out that the chain of transmission, they all go to four Palestinian families that resided in Jerusalem. And I will not go into too much detail, but based on the soundness of the chain of transmission, he concluded that the Fadā'i'l al-Quds could be used to reconstruct the early Islamic history of Jerusalem, to reconstruct the building of the Dome of the Rock by Abd al-Malik, the Umayyad Khalif, and also to reconstruct the early history of Jerusalem during Omar's conquest and visit to the city. And finally, he validated the use of the Fadā'i'l al-Quds to delineate the practice of Islamic pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the pre-Crusades period. Now, during the last 10 years of the 20th century, another Israeli scholar published al-Musharraf ibn al-Murajjah's work, of Afar Livne Kafri. He wrote that. He published a critical edition of al-Musharraf ibn al-Murajjah's work, but also work in the Middle East by Arab historians came to the forefront here, because we have one of the famous Palestinian scholars, Kamil Jamil al-Asali. He wrote a very important work, which is he produced a bibliographical catalog of all manuscripts on Fadā'i'l al-Quds. So up to the late 20th century, we only have 2 or 4 works that have been edited and published. But because Al-Asali presented every single work in the genre and presented to the reader the manuscripts and their location, and a bit about the work, a bit on the biography of each author, that catalog became a great stimulus to the the editing and publishing of almost all the Fadā'i'l al-Quds work from the Mamlūk period and elsewhere in the Arab world. So after the 20th century, the Arab historians and scholars in the Middle East really took over the production of editions of Fadā'i'l al-Quds, and with the availability, it really opened up the field to modern scholarship, including my work on the Fadā'i'l al-Quds from the Mamlūk period.
And then more recently, Sulaiman Murad has argued that the sanctification of Jerusalem was a process rather than a given. So how has this changed the way scholars read these texts?
Well, it's interesting when you look at this argument by Sulaiman Murad. We have to link this argument to works by, for example, M.J. Kister. So Kister, in one of his publications, he mentions how while there are Fadā'i'l al-Quds traditions circulating in the first century, encouraging Muslims to visit Jerusalem, to sanctify Jerusalem, there were other competing traditions at the time that were arguing against the sanctity of Jerusalem. Of course, those traditions fall within the Umayyad Abbasid struggles. It falls within the Umayyad Ibn al-Zubair's house in Mecca and Medina. So you have to see those traditions that are against the sanctification of Jerusalem within the larger political framework occurring in the first and second Hijri century. You have the wars between the Umayyads and the Mecca and Medina. You have the wars of the Umayyads eventually with the Abbasids. You have the Shia Sunni beginning wars from Iraq after Karbala. So since the Umayyads were centered in Damascus and they had the spiritual center in Jerusalem, you see that scholars from Karbala and after the martyrdom of Hussein circulating traditions against the sanctity of Jerusalem. So in a way, the sanctity of Jerusalem in early Islam had a bit of a fluidity to it, which follows the argument of Sulaiman Murad that it took a bit of a while for it to be fully entrenched as one of the 3 sacred places in Islam. Another reason for that is that the important narrative on the Isra, on the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad, the debate on the Isra, whether it was done physically by Muhammad or it was in his dream or it was done by contemplation while he's in Mecca, it was a debate that lasted for about a century within Islamic scholars at the time. So you read those debates on whether Muhammad actually traveled on the Buraq and went to Jerusalem and prayed with biblical prophets, or he had the dream. You see those debates within the Quranic exegesis on the verse 17.1, the first verse of chapter 17. So again, this process of sanctification of Jerusalem was a process if we also look on the debates on the Isra, the night journey of the Prophet. But I think the Umayyads, by the time the Dome of the Rock was built, it really enshrined Jerusalem as quite an important spiritual center within the Islamic faith.
So, as you sort of mentioned there, by the Mamlūk period, there's a quite dramatic expansion in the production of Faḍāʻil text about Jerusalem. What are the main ways in which these texts are different from those earlier ones, the kind of pre-Crusading period ones and the ones, for example, from the Ayyubid period?
Sure, that's an excellent question. Now, one of the arguments that I made in my dissertation and a chapter that I wrote for our Groningen conference is that we begin to see changes and innovations and even transformations in the Fadā'i'l al-Quds books that are written during the Mamlūk period. The most obvious one, which I've discussed earlier, is the large number of works authored and produced during the period. In fact, out of the 13, if you look at the 13 works that were written, in combination, there's more extant works from the Mamluk period than all other periods combined.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we look at the titles of the works, of those Fadā'i'l Quds works written in the Mamluk period, before the Mamluk period, the titles of the works are more basic. They would be Fadā'i'l al-Quds or Fadā'i'l al-Bayt al-Muqaddas. So they were simple titles given to the collection of traditions on Jerusalem. But with the onset of the Mamluk period, we see longer, more lyrical titles that encourage specifically pilgrimage to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Kitab Ba'ith al-Nufus li-Ziyarat al-Quds al-Mahrus. So there's an emphasis in the titles on ziyara, which is the visitation, pilgrimage visitation to Jerusalem, the practice. We have, for example, Muthir al-Gharam ila Ziyarat al-Quds wa-Sham. So again, arousing the souls to come and perform pilgrimage in Jerusalem. So just from the titles, we can see a kind of a quantitative assessment of this spike in at least encouraging Muslims to come visit Jerusalem. What we also see, which I partly discussed, is the backgrounds of the author's writing. Now, before the Mamluk period, the authors were basically local Jerusalemite, Palestinian, or Syrian. But in the Mamluk period, really, the net is cast wide. You have authors from Al-Maghrib, you have authors from Khawarizm, you have authors from Egypt. So the backgrounds also show how the sanctity of Jerusalem and pilgrimage to Jerusalem has been really emphasized across the Islamic worlds, which I've argued in my thesis is the result of the impact of the Crusades, really, and the loss of Jerusalem to the Franks for almost a century. What we also witness importantly in those works is that you begin to see the incorporation of significantly new material in the Fadā'i'l al-Quds. One major new material is actually we see the incorporation of Islamic law, the ahkam, masail and ahkam, the legal questions and legal precepts and teachings on pilgrimage itself. So you see some works being organized anthologically in terms of legal questions. Can Muslims perform a pilgrimage to Jerusalem? Does praying in Jerusalem have a higher reward than praying elsewhere? And most importantly, for my scholarship, which I've published in an article and in my dissertation, there was this question that can Muslims enter churches in Jerusalem? So we begin to see in the Mamluk period Islamic law being imported and incorporated within those Fadā'i'l Quds works that never really existed before. So the question for it in a short answer is yes, Muslims can enter and pray in Jerusalem, but it also depends on the madhab. The Shafi'is are more flexible, but Hanbalis like Ibn Taymiyyah strictly forbid Muslims to enter churches and pray there in Jerusalem. Another novelty within the corpus is that we see the expansion of the number of holy sites that Muslims are encouraged to visit. So I've counted more than 40 holy sites from the Mamluk Faḍāʻil, which are spread across the Haram al-Sharif, across the city, and even outside its walls, versus Amikam Ilad's work that focuses on the Faḍāʻil from the from the pre-Crusades period. He found there's only 15 holy sites within the Fadā'i'l Quds composed before the 12th century. So that's another important aspect, which is the expansion of the sacred sphere within the city based on the holy sites enumerated in the Fadā'i'l Quds. And finally, another important change that we see is we find the anthological structure of the Fadā'i'l Quds change somewhat. In the past, we see there's an emphasis on the sanctity of Jerusalem in some works, and in other works, the sanctity of Jerusalem and Ash-Sham and Greater Syria. The sanctity of Jerusalem is connected to Damascus and connected to other Syrian cities. During the Mamluk period, we find that some works are anthologically structured in a way that the sanctity of Jerusalem is connected to Mecca and Medina. So you have works such as I'lam al-Sajid bi Ahkam al-Masajid. We have works that divide divide themselves into three books: a book on the sanctity and the Faḍāʻil of Mecca, a book on the sanctity and the Faḍāʻil of Medina, and a third book on the sanctity and the Faḍāʻil of Jerusalem. So this genre of ahkam al-masajid, or the laws of mosques, of how to enter mosques, how to behave in mosques, how to conduct in mosques, enters the corpus and has significant sections on the Faḍāʻil of Jerusalem and Islamic law in Jerusalem.
Okay, thank you. So, do you think it would be fair to say then that some of these texts, at least, start to resemble guidebooks? And do they assume that there might be a reader who might actually have the book with them, walking around the city, using it as some kind of guide?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, one of the purposes of the Fadāʻil al-Quds is that it is written with the intention of mind to encourage Muslims to come visit Jerusalem. As early as the texts of the 11th century, before the onset of the Crusades, the text of al-Musharraf ibn al-Murajja, his text has a specific pilgrimage itinerary. So that began before the onset of the Crusades. But what is interesting with the Mamlūk texts is that not only do you have the same itinerary, but the itinerary expands for more holy sites. And you have the authors who actually came to Jerusalem and wrote their works there begin to compare and contrast those holy sites with the way they were described and explained in previous Fadāʻil al-Quds works. So you begin to see authors comparing and contrasting the location, for example, of a holy site and when it should be visited and what rituals such as prayers and dua should be done at each site. So you begin to see, again, the enshrining of pilgrimage itineraries within the Mamlūk period, but that are more expansive. And you see personal observations and remarks of the authors themselves regarding certain holy sites and places that are sacred in Jerusalem and enumerated in the Fadāʻil al-Quds.
So in that
and in fact, when we look at sorry,
Ben. So in that sense, then there's some kind of feedback loop, feedback cycle with texts encouraging visitations and then visitations encouraging texts and authors borrowing from each other in order to kind of expand that kind of the shared repertoire of sacred spaces in Jerusalem through these texts.
Yeah, I've argued in my dissertation how it's kind of a reinforcing cycle where the Fadāʻil al-Quds written with their titles, we can see that they encourage Muslims to come. So someone like Shamsuddin al-Suyuti promised that if God allows him to visit Jerusalem, he will do a pilgrimage there and he will write a Fadāʻil al-Quds work. So he comes and he stays in Jerusalem and he writes his own Fadāʻil al-Quds work. Part of it is also for them to reveal to themselves and to the readers what is the purpose of visiting Jerusalem, what is the pilgrimage itinerary that they have to follow, because it's quite complex. And third of all, it is written with encouraging others in the Islamic world to perform pilgrimage. So you have this reaffirming cycle of Muslims visiting Jerusalem, staying there, doing pilgrimage, writing a Fadāʻil al-Quds work, and the Fadāʻil al-Quds work has titles that encourage other Muslims to come and do pilgrimage, and hence other Muslims would read this work and they would come. We have one of the clearest evidence of that, for example, in the Mamlūk period, where I spoke about as-Suyuti, and he compares the holy sites in his Fadāʻil al-Quds to other Fadāʻil al-Quds written before him. But during the Ottoman period, we find scholars such as the famous Abdul Ghani al-Nabulsi. He's a famous Sufi sheikh from Damascus. He actually was carrying Fadāʻil al-Quds books from the Mamlūk period with him, and he was visiting each holy site in Jerusalem and stating and referencing the authors from the Mamlūk period, what they say about each holy site and what he should perform in terms of supplications, in terms of prayers. So By the time the Ottoman period rolls around, we have very direct evidence that those works are pilgrimage guides, and we have authors such as An-Nabulsi, who wrote in his travelogue on Jerusalem that he used all those Mamluk period works to guide him around Jerusalem and the Holy Land for his pilgrimage itinerary.
Mm. Okay. I was just wondering then how you mentioned a little earlier that there was a process by which the Mamluks tried to Islamize Jerusalem. How, I mean, I can see how the Fadāʻil literature would help with that. How would pilgrimage assist in that process? Because it seems to be like they're trying to encourage pilgrimage. So is that part of that kind of Islamization process? And if so, how would that be?
Yes, because we have to also look at the more global context. Jerusalem is a very holy city for Christians.
Mm.
And during the Mamluk period, we have the influx of Christian pilgrims from Europe coming constantly and continuously to visit Jerusalem.
Mm.
So encouraging Islamic pilgrimage and having Muslim pilgrims come visit Jerusalem and stay there further re-Islamized the sacred landscape of the city, because the Mamluk state and society wanted to basically flood Jerusalem with more Muslim pilgrims coming in.
Mm.
In a way, it also helps their cause as great rulers of the city who accommodate and provide services to pilgrims through those social and economic institutions.
Mm.
And in return, a lot of those pilgrims enshrine and engender the status of the city in the faith, but also pray and give thanks to those Muslim Mamluk sultans who actually allowed pilgrimage to flourish. So for example, within the chronicles of Mujir ad-Din and within the Haram documents, we see clearly that the Mamluk sultans of Cairo, they came and did visits to Jerusalem, and they contributed to the holy sites by renovating them or rebuilding them.
Mm.
They made endowments for the Haram al-Sharif through taxing certain villages, through providing certain funds. So there's this symbiotic relationship between the Mamluk sultans taking care of Jerusalem and ruling it and giving it a newer and stronger Islamic character by also inviting and allowing those pilgrims to come in by providing to them through accommodations by institutions, by madrasas, by other places where they can stay and study.
Thanks to Dr. Fadi Ragheb for guiding us through part one of this interview. If you've enjoyed it, please do consider liking, commenting, or subscribing. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with part two. Please do join me then if you can.